The clerk of the Privy Council has 3 jobs. He is the head of all bureaucracy. All the deputy ministers come under the clerk of the Privy Council. The clerk of the Privy Council is also the deputy minister to the Prime Minister. And he's secretary to the cabinet. So he's got all the powers. It is the Prime Minister who appoints ministers. It's the Prime Minister who appoints senators. It is the Prime Minister who appoints judges. So therefore the courts are also somehow responsible to the Prime Minister for the favor. But the judiciary has some powers, but the only power the judiciary has, the Supreme Court has, is to rule over existing law. When an existing law is broken, then the matter can go all the way up to the Supreme Court over existing law. In our situation, that existing law is the Food and Drugs Act. The Food and Drugs Act, as I said, was initiated in 1906 because after the Americans declared independence, all of a sudden they got the land, they got the food, they got the water, they got the resources, but they didn't have medicines. Those medicines were being imported from England. There were not much of medicine, everything was natural. Dr. Dodd's pills, this decoction, that tincture, and this and that, bottles. They didn't do much good, but they didn't do much harm either. So the Americans banned all products, all materials to be imported from England. And they said, we'll make our own. And as they started to make their own, then of course there were charlatans. They started to make all kinds of medications, mostly alcohol. But when they got too excited, they would even put turpentine oil and all kinds of poisons and so forth. It was snake oil medicine. And a lot of people began to die as a result. It was because of that in 1906, a law was passed. It was called Adulteration Act, which meant whatever you manufacture and commercialize must be chemically pure. In other words, this law doesn't apply to your natural foods or water, but if you add something to it, or you process it, or do something, then you cannot adulterate. So it was called the Adulteration Act, 1906. Things began to work for a while, and then allopathic medicine, what we now call allopathic medicine, began at the same time, approximately the same time. The modern drugs, allopathic drugs, began to be invented, mostly in Germany. The first drugs that were manufactured, or some of the first drugs, were sulfonamides. Infection used to be a big problem in those days. So sulfonamides were invented to control pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, and so on. Problem was, these sulfonamide pills were large pills. They were difficult to swallow, and they could not be dissolved in water. So somebody came up with the idea that if I take sulfonamide pill, or this tablet, grind it up, put it in some sort of a chemical solvent, and put some sugar and some flavoring agent, then people could drink it as syrup. And then they gave it. In 1938, 100 Americans died from taking this medication. The solvent that was used was a chemical called ethylene glycol, the same stuff that you use for windshield wiper fluid. Then the people, scientists, realized that Adulteration Act is not good enough. So we have to do something about it. Take this, every product that you use, whether it's incipient or excipient, in other words, the actual drug or the external, everything must be tested in living animals to show that it will not kill them, it will not harm them, and so on. So toxicological tests should be done on living animals, at least in 2 species, one of which must be a non-rodent, so that get closer to people. In other words, it's not just rats and mice, but you must also take dogs, cats, maybe sometimes monkeys, and ultimately test it on humans and so forth before it can be commercialized. That happened in 1945. Things began to work for a while. Then all of a sudden, we come into 1962, and thalidomide happened. Nobody thought of the embryo. Usually, scientists cannot. Such accidents are only realized post facto. We cannot predict what will happen, but when it happens, then you say, it's horror. Again, this thing actually was made, thalidomide was made by a German company, distillers. And thousands of children were born with deformities. And a doctor went to a hospital and found out there was a sudden increase in this. What happened? Then they associated back to thalidomide and showed that it actually was. So, thalidomide was approved in Canada, but not in the United States as yet, when the actual symptoms began to appear. The person who did not approve it in Canada, in the United States, was a Canadian woman, medical doctor, Frances Kelsey. She was, like me, was a drug evaluator. She was asking questions, more questions. So by chance, it got delayed. It wasn't approved. And then in 1964, Frances Kelsey was honored by President Kennedy with a gold medal. The world was thankful to Frances Kelsey, the Canadian doctor. Now, from here on, the story begins to get pretty dirty, nasty, deliberately suppressing all this information. Because what people were saying, now there are drugs available, there are antibiotics, there's all kinds of inventions, so therefore they're too expensive. We've got to bring their cost down. But the companies now, the governments started to hand over the production of vaccines, drugs, whatever, to private companies with the hope that the money they make from those, by selling those drugs, would be reinvested into new research. And we will get endless supply of newer and newer life-saving drugs. At least so claimed these companies. And as soon as that was done, the same companies started to complain, your regulations, Food and Drugs Act, are too tough. You're asking too many questions. You're saying do test for teratology, you're saying do test for birth defects, embryonic tests, cancer and this and that. It's too expensive. We can't do it, so therefore we cannot invent any new things. Deregulate. In 1967, the law, the newest Food and Drugs Act, the revision, took place. In 1969, I joined Health Canada. With great vigor, this whole idea of evaluating products from companies began.